Hi, welcome to today's virtual tour of Lowell Cemetery. I'm Richard Howe. I'll be your tour guide. Lowell Cemetery is located at 77 Knapp Avenue, just off Route 38, right next to Shed Park in the Belvedere neighborhood of Lowell. Lowell Cemetery is a garden-style cemetery. It was founded in 1841, and it was modeled after Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. Now, if you think about colonial times, usually the cemetery was squeezed in next to the local church, and the markers were all close together. They contained very ominous-looking artwork inscribed on them. But then in maybe the 1820s, in the Transcendentalist movement, people started changing the way they looked at the connection between life and death. They saw that life was really just the death was just a continuation of life, it was all part of the cycle of nature. And so they started designing cemeteries to reflect the connection between human death and nature. And that's where garden style cemeteries came from. Both Mount Auburn and Lowell Cemetery used landscape architects to design the grounds. And they really became almost public parks of their days. They remain beautiful today. Now, each fall and each spring, I lead tours through the cemetery, usually one on a Saturday, one on a Sunday morning. And in the spring, we do one side of the cemetery. In the fall, we do another. But today is the first virtual tour where people can just sit back and watch on a screen. Usually what I do is talk about some of the people buried in the cemetery. And this is often the first stop. The gentleman buried here is named Agustin Thompson. He was born in 1835 in Maine. He, like many of his generation, went into the Union Army during the Civil War. He became a lieutenant colonel. And after the war, he went to medical school. Now, Lowell was a booming place in the 1870s, so he came here and he started his medical practice. Thompson was very successful, and like other doctors of the day, he started devising his own medicines for his patients. Now, back then, there was no pharmaceutical industry. Instead, doctors would come up with some remedy. They would write down the recipe for that, give it to the patient, and the patient would take it to the local pharmacy where the pharmacist would follow the doctor's instructions. One of the medicines that was particularly popular that Thompson created was a type of syrup that was used, among other things, to calm an upset stomach. And it became so popular that Thompson um, closed down his medical practice and devoted all of his energy to creating this medicine. And then eventually the Pure Food and Drug Act made it much more difficult to make medicine. And so Thompson diluted the stomach syrup with soda water, and he bottled it and sold it as a soft drink, and he called it Moxie. And so Moxie was invented by Lowell, Massachusetts, by Dr. Agustin Thompson. Next is the most famous monument in the Lowell Cemetery, and that's the Eyre Lion. It's the burial place of James C. Eyre. He also was a medicine maker. He went to medical school, he never practiced, but he came to Lowell in 1835 and he opened a drugstore. And he instead of allowing doctors to just give him a prescription of what to mix together, Eyre started making medicine himself. And this gained the animosity of the medical profession, but Eyre did it anyway, and his medicines were very popular. He made a large amount of money from his factory on Middle Street in downtown Lowell, which is now known as the Eyre Lofts. Eyre lived to be 1878 when he died. He was very wealthy. So his wife and children paid an artist to carve this lion out of marble, and the artist came and installed it here in the Lowell Cemetery. Eyre had a brother. His name was Frederick Eyre. He's buried not far from where James is located. Frederick was a partner of James in the medicine business, but he also branched out and became a mill owner. He owned a number of woolen mills around Massachusetts and New England. Frederick lived in the house at the corner of Pawtucket Street and School Street, which has most recently been known as the Franco-American School. Also of note is that Frederick Eyre had a daughter named Beatrice, who in 1911 married a young lieutenant in the United States Army named George S. Patton. And so it's fair to say that General Patton of World War II fame had his in-laws living in Lowell, Massachusetts. This structure is a mausoleum. A mausoleum is a building above ground that contains the remains of deceased individuals. This is the Shedd family mausoleum, and the patriarch was Freeman Ballard Shedd. Shedd was born in Lowell in 1844, and like Eyre, he went to work at a drugstore. There he met another young man named Eli Hoyt, and they became lifelong friends and business partners. Eyre, when he was only 16 years old, enlisted in the Union Army, and he went and served throughout the Civil War, but he served as a medical orderly. He was in Sherman's army that fought in Tennessee and then Georgia and then South Carolina. When he returned to Lowell, he went back to the drugstore and he found that Eli Hoyt, in his absence, had concocted not a medicine, but a cologne. He called it Hoyt's Cologne. And it was pretty popular, but Freeman Shedd had a real knack for marketing. And he said to Hoyt, let's call it Hoyt's German Cologne. Well, Hoyt said, really doesn't have anything to do with Germany. And Shedd said, well, nobody will know that, and it sounds more exotic and will sell more. And they did sell a lot more. It was hugely popular. One innovation that Shedd brought to the business was this was the age when color printing became widespread and affordable. This is when baseball cards started emerging. Well, what Shedd did was he printed up a bunch of colored cards for Hoyt's German Cologne, and he dunked them into a bucket of the cologne, pulled them out, and let them dry. And then he distributed them. And so Freeman Shedd is the inventor of the scented advertising card. This is the what's called the receiving tomb in the cemetery. It was actually donated by Freeman Shedd in honor of his son, Eli Hoyt Shedd, who died when he was only 9 years old from meningitis. A receiving tomb is a place to store the bodies of deceased individuals who are awaiting burial. Now, if you think about it, in the days before backhoes and jackhammers, you really couldn't bury people in the wintertime in New England because the ground was frozen. So the cemetery would use this, the receiving tomb, to hold the bodies until the spring and the ground thawed and they could be buried. The original design of this had two bronze sphinxes on the pillars, this rectangular granite pillars to the front of the receiving tomb. However, in the 1970s, one of them was stolen. The cemetery retained the other one, and we hope at some point to get a replacement and to reinstall them, or at least some alternative material. Now, our next stop is another mausoleum. This is the burial place of Moses Greeley Parker. He's the person that the Dracut Library is named for. Parker was a doctor. He graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1863, and he went right into the Union Army, and he became a surgeon. And he spent a lot of time in Virginia towards the end of the war. When he returned to Lowell, he established his medical practice. He specialized in eye injuries and surgery. Parker became incredibly wealthy, but it was not through his medical practice. It was through a shrewd investment. One day in 1876, Parker went to Huntington Hall, which was that day's equivalent of the Lowell Memorial Auditorium, to see a presentation by a young inventor named Alexander Graham Bell. Bell was demonstrating his new invention, the telephone. Parker immediately saw the value of the phone for him as a doctor. If someone needed a doctor to come to their house, they wouldn't have to send someone to summons the doctor. They could just pick up the telephone and call him. So Parker invested heavily in Bell's enterprise, and he became the largest stockholder of New England Telephone and Telegraph. Parker is also said to be the inventor of the telephone number. Just a few years after Lowell had established one of the first telephone exchanges in the United States, a measles epidemic broke out in the city and many people were being quarantined. At that time, there were only 4 women who knew how to operate the switchboard that ran the whole phone system. Parker was concerned if these 4 individuals were quarantined, the phone system would shut down. So he thought that if you numbered each one of the wires, it would be easier for somebody else to come in and use the system. He suggested numbering wires to Bell. Bell liked the idea, adopted it, and that's where the phone number came from. There's quite a few noteworthy individuals in the Lowell Cemetery. This is Charles Herbert Allen. He was born here. He served on the Lowell School Committee. He was elected to Congress. And in 1898, he was made the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Well, that's when the Spanish-American War occurred. And as part of the outcome of the war, which the United States won, they defeated Spain, the United States gained possession of Cuba and Puerto Rico, which were Spanish territories. The United States named the first governor of Puerto Rico, Charles Herbert Allen of Lowell. Paul Tsongas, the United States senator who died in 1997, is also buried in Lowell Cemetery. Tsongas was born in Lowell in 1944. He grew up here. He went to Lowell High School. He went to Dartmouth College, served in the Peace Corps. He came back, he ran for and was elected to the Lowell City Council in 1969. He was elected Middlesex County Commissioner in 72. He was elected to Congress in 1974 and to the U.S. Senate in 1978. 1984, he chose not to run for re-election after he had been diagnosed with cancer. With his cancer in remission in 1992, he ran for President of the United States. He lost the Democratic nomination to Bill Clinton, who went on to become president. Tsongas' cancer returned and he died in 1997. 2 other members of Congress are buried in Lowell Cemetery. They were married to one another. On the left is John Jacob Rogers, who was elected to Congress in 1913. He served until his untimely death in 1925. His wife, Edith Nourse Rogers, was appointed to finish out her late husband's term. That was fairly common. It was called a social appointment and allowed the surviving spouse to wrap up her affairs in Washington and return home and resume her life as a widow. Well, Edith Nourse Rogers returned home and she ran for Congress in her own right. And she was elected in 1925, and she served continuously up until her own death in 1960. When Rogers died, she was the longest continuously serving female member of Congress until just recently. Barbara Mikulski of Maryland broke Rogers' record. This is where Edith and John Jacob Rogers are buried. Another famous person buried in Lowell Cemetery is James B. Francis. If any young people who go to UMass Lowell are watching, that he is the person that the engineering school is named for, the James B. Francis School of Engineering. Francis was the second chief engineer of the Lowell Locks and Canals Company. company that ran all of the canals that powered the great mills here. He was a mechanical genius. He devised all kinds of ways of making the water run faster, which created more power for the mills. Francis actually designed his own monument at Lowell Cemetery, and he used blocks of granite of the type that lined the walls of the canals in Lowell to construct the monument. Perhaps Francis's most lasting achievement was this structure called the Francis Gate. It's at one of the first lock chambers on the Pawtucket Canal. Francis was concerned that in a flood, the Merrimack River would sweep through the canals and flood downtown Lowell. So he constructed this large wooden gate, worked sort of like a guillotine, that in the event of a flood, they could cut the chain that held it up, it would drop down, and it would block the route of the water into the canal. Well, at the time it was constructed, people ridiculed Francis. They called it Francis's folly. They thought it was a waste of money. But soon thereafter, there was a major flood. The gate dropped, and it saved the city, and people stopped making fun of him then. As recently as 2006, in the great spring flood of that year, a substitute gate that was made out of metal was emplaced right in front of the Francis Gate, and it served the same purpose. Lowell has an interesting literary history, and a person on the periphery of that was a woman named Nancy Richmond. She and her husband owned one of the mills on the Concord River, and so they were fairly affluent. Nancy had a brother who was a principal in the Lowell Public Schools, and that brother arranged to have a famous writer, Edgar Allan Poe, come to Lowell to do a presentation. Poe came, he gave a talk on literature in America. Everyone who attended, including Nancy Richmond, thought it was wonderful. After the performance, she and her husband went, introduced themselves to Poe, and asked in passing where Poe was staying that night. He said at the local hotel. Mr. and Mrs. Richmond said no, they wouldn't hear of it. They had him come and stay at their home. Mr. Richmond went to bed. Nancy stayed up, talked to Edgar all night long. They began a letter correspondence, and Poe came back to Lowell several times to speak. He always stayed at the Richmond household. And the surviving letters show that there was an intimate relationship between the two. And Poe's, one of his last poems before he died, he titled For Annie. It was a love poem, and he wrote Nancy Richmond a note saying, "This is for you." Poe died, Mr. Richmond died, and Nancy Richmond, before she even probated her late husband's estate, went into the probate court and had her first name legally changed from Nancy to Annie in reflection of the poem. So I think it's fair to say that Edgar Allan Poe's girlfriend is buried in Lowell Cemetery. The Civil War played a major part in Lowell. 5,000 men from the city served in the Union Army and Navy, and 500 of them died. Two of them were young brothers, Edward Abbott and Henry Abbott. They're buried side by side in this lot that's right near the chapel. Edward died. He was killed in action in 1862, the Battle of Cedar Mountain, and Henry died towards the end of the war in the Battle of the Wilderness. Veterans have an honored place in the Lowell Cemetery. There's one particular lot called the Grand Army of the Republic lot, where all of the people who lie in rest there are veterans. The Grand Army of the Republic was the largest veterans organization of Union veterans of the Civil War. It was very active in civic and political affairs throughout the rest of the 19th century. And in 1898, at about the time of the Spanish-American War, the Women's Auxiliary of the Grand Army of the Republic donated this lot to the Lowell Cemetery. And now I mentioned earlier about the early monuments, And this is an example of one. It's a slate stone. It's one of the first ones installed at Lowell Cemetery. It's the burial place of Susan Parker, who was a mill girl who died at a young age. She actually died in 1831. She was buried elsewhere, and when Lowell Cemetery opened, her body was moved and she was reinterred here. This is a close-up of a willow tree and an urn that are inscribed in the slate. Now, as the Industrial Revolution came, advances in technology allowed more elaborate designs. Specifically, steam power could drive power tools. So you can see from the simple inscriptions on slate, you now have very ornately carved monuments of marble and granite. And here are some examples. This is one of my favorite monuments in Lowell Cemetery. It's the burial place of Horace Ebert, E-B-E-R-T. Horace was a small businessman. He ran a harness shop where he sold harnesses for wagons and coaches. Every night when he came home, he sat down in a chair in his living room and he read a book. Well, the chair he sat in looks exactly like this one, right down to the dog heads on the arms of the chair. A local cemetery monument creator named James Andrews was able to make an exact duplicate of Ebert's chair. And he even left the open book in the seat of the chair as both as a nod to Ebert's love of reading, but also for functional reasons to prevent people from sitting in the chair. Books played a big role in Lowell. This is two families, the Baker and the Brant family, B-R-A-D-T. They have two books, one laying horizontally, the other one standing up and opened. The Brant family ran a bakery in the acre right near University Crossing. They made crackers by the name of Brant crackers. Owens Street was a minister, the first Congregational church. When he died, he also was very interested in geology. So his interest in geology was represented by the rough stone that formed the base of his marker, and his religious profession is indicated by the open Bible on the top of his monument. Modern monuments use computers to drive power tools, and there's more realism incorporated into the design of the monuments. Here's a couple examples of how the life image of the deceased is actually inscribed into the stone. So besides serving as really substitutes for public parks when they first opened in the 1840s, cemeteries also were sort of a outdoor art museum. There were no public art museums at the time, so people used to come to the cemetery on Sunday, their one day off, walk around, sometimes have a picnic lunch, and they'd admire the monuments. This is the Ayer Monument. This is another one. It's the burial place of a woman named Clara Bonnie, B-O-N-N-E-Y. She was married to a lawyer named, she was the daughter of a lawyer named Arthur Bonnie. She married another lawyer named Charles Lilly, and she died, unfortunately, at age 41 of tuberculosis, just a year after she gave birth to the couple's only child. The father and the husband hired a very famous sculptor, Frank Elwell, who was the head of the sculpture division of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to create this unique monument for Clara Bonnie, and that's one of the most popular monuments in the Lowell Cemetery. And I'll close with the story of Louisa Maria Wells. She was a young girl who came from Vermont. She worked in the mills. After Louisa's father died, her widowed mother came to Lowell and became a boarding house keeper. Louisa spent her entire life working in the mills. She never married. She had no siblings. Her mother died. She was buried elsewhere. Um, but one thing Louisa did was she saved all her money and she put it in the bank. And when she died, she left a will. And in her will, she said she wanted her entire estate to be used to buy a suitable monument for herself and her mother at Lowell Cemetery. Well, the lawyer who was probating her estate reached out to Daniel Chester French, who was from Concord, Massachusetts. French was by then a famous sculptor. He had created the Minuteman statue in Concord and the Abraham Lincoln and the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. French said he was much too busy to do this job, but he suggested hiring one of his associates, a young woman named Evelyn Longman, to create the monument. I might add that even though Louisa Wells had no siblings, she had cousins. And when the cousins learned of the will and the amount of money that was going to be used for a cemetery monument, they contested the will and they held up the distribution of the funds for almost 20 years. Well, the silver lining of that disagreeable situation was that the accumulated interest caused the money to almost double. And so Evelyn Longman was able to create a magnificent monument. Here's a picture of it. It depicts two figures. The standing one is an angel. Longman called the angel of death. But if you look closely at the angel's face, it's not the type of threatening or ominous appearance that you would think when you heard angel of death. Instead, it's a calming, peaceful look on the face of the angel. Now, the seated figure is a woman. She's dressed in the simple dress of a mill worker of the time. And in her right hand is a bobbin, or a large spool of yarn. And the yarn is unspooled across the mill worker's lap where it comes to a sudden end. That end of the yarn symbolizes the end of life. And the look on the mill worker's face expresses fatigue and tiredness. And so what Longman was trying to accomplish was to send a message that death is not something to be feared, but death, which is coming with the angel touching the mill worker on the shoulder, will bring you peace and restfulness after all the toil of a difficult life. And that concludes my virtual tour of Lowell Cemetery. There are many, many other monuments and stories to be told. So please check back again for more, another virtual tour, which will bring you entirely new stories and new monuments. Thanks for joining.